Welcome back to another episode of Fantastic Voyage, the David Bowie podcast. I'm Jesse.
And I'm John.
Today we are talking about the 1983 film, The Hunger. And I should get this out of the way right away, that this is a spoiler episode. So if you haven't seen The Hunger, 1983, Tony Scott's first film, go and see it because we are going to spoil pretty much everything in the movie. Today, to discuss The Hunger, which is a horror movie, we brought in a very special guest from the Evolution of Horror podcast, Mike Muncer. Thanks for joining us, Mike. How are you doing?
Hello. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I'm good, thanks. How are you guys?
We're doing good.
Doing great.
Yeah.
Excited to have you.
Very excited to have you. For our listeners, could you maybe just give us a little tidbit about yourself and your podcast, Evolution of Horror?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a producer and film journalist and podcaster in London. I produce and host the Evolution of Horror podcast, which is a sort of movie history podcast, I guess. Obviously, it focuses on the horror genre, and we look at the whole genre from its origins through to the present day. So we'll go back and we'll cover, everything from like the old Universal movies of the 30s, or even go beyond that to sort of early silent movies, and work our way through to the present day. But we do it in sort of particular subgenres. So we'll look at just the slasher movie from its early origins through to now. And then we'll look at ghost movies. And then currently, funnily enough, we're doing vampire movies. So it's me joined by a different guest every week, and we look at a particular horror movie and its sort of place in horror history, I suppose. Great fun. Basically, I just get to chat about horror movies with cool people every week.
It's awesome. I fell in love with your podcast last, I guess it was fall. I was looking for a horror podcast to watch, and the slasher ones, which we're both huge fans of. That was a lot of fun hearing you talk about those. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, the slasher movies are so much fun to watch and also to talk about, because there is actually a surprising amount of interesting ground to cover with those movies,
Totally, yeah.
So before we get into the movie we're talking about today, I was curious about your history with David Bowie. Living in the UK, I imagine you had a lot of exposure to him, growing up. So, do you have any favorite Bowie albums, any favorite Bowie songs? Is he a big deal to you in terms of your musical interests?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you're right. I feel like I can't even remember how, at what point in my life I sort of discovered David Bowie. I think it was probably always there for me because of my parents listening to him. So it would have been kind of there from ground zero, along with bands like the Beatles. I think David Bowie played in my house all the time. So I always will pop on a bit of David Bowie on Spotify, on playlists and that kind of thing. I love his music. I think if I had a favorite album, it would maybe be Hunky Dory, or one of those kind of I like the sort of chilled sort of piano vibe to that album, but I kind of love everything really. The tracks on that album, like Oh You Pretty Things and Changes, and of course Life on Mars, are some of my favorites probably. But I also went through a phase as a teenager when I loved some of his kind of weirder 90s stuff, like I'm Deranged and songs from the Outside album.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was partly because I became obsessed with David Lynch, the filmmaker. And there's a kind of David Lynch connection there. There's a sort of David Lynchy vibe. Obviously, I'm Deranged was used in the opening credits of Lost Highway in 1997. Right. I think I fell in love with Lost Highway, the film, and then kind of tracked down some of that slightly weirder, less mainstream Bowie music from that as well. So I went through a phase of really enjoying that kind of stuff. But yeah, I would say I definitely kind of grew up on the classics, Ziggy Stardust and all of that kind of stuff. But yeah, I've always been a fan. Speaking
of Bowie and Lynch, yes or no to Bowie's American accent in Fire Walk With Me?
Do you know what? As a British person, it probably bothers me less than it does for Americans, I don't mind it too much. And I think, again, the film is so weird and the performance styles are so weird that David Bowie doing something a bit weird in that movie doesn't really bother me too much. I adore that movie, and that scene with David Bowie is one of my favorite moments in that film as well. So yeah, I'm a fan.
So this is not Bowie's first venture into horror. He was one of two people in a very short film called The Image in 1969. Michael Armstrong directed that about a year before he did Mark of the Devil, which was that was, I think, the one where they said this is the scariest movie ever made, and they handed out puke bags in the theaters and stuff like that. So this, I mean, this is the first feature film of him in horror, and it's really the only horror, full-length movie that he did. I guess Labyrinth could be somewhat considered horror, right?
I guess.
Yeah, David Bowie in Labyrinth used to scare me as a child, to be fair.
Maybe unconventional horror.
Yeah.
Some of his music videos in the 90s could be horror movies, like was it The Heart's Filthy Lesson?
Oh yeah,
that's definitely from the Outside album too. Yeah, that's a scary video.
Yeah, we're really looking forward to covering the Outside album, that will be coming up shortly. But yeah, let's get into The Hunger. Mike, on your show, you like to get your guests to give a little plot synopsis at the beginning. Could you do the honors for 1983's The Hunger?
Now, the reason I get other people to do this is because I'm pretty bad at it myself, but I'll give it a go. So The Hunger, so this is a 1983 movie. Like you said, it's Tony Scott directed it. And it's really, in some ways, the plot is kind of simple, really. And it relies more on that vibe, those Tony Scott visuals and its soundtrack. But basically, it's the story of a kind of love triangle of vampires, I suppose. So at the beginning of the film, we meet Catherine Deneuve and David Bowie. They play this kind of vampire couple. And they seem to live this quite glamorous, affluent life. They're very cool. They're musicians. They're in love. But then something strange starts to happen to David Bowie's character in the first act. He starts to suddenly age very, very rapidly. And, vampires aren't really supposed to age. But in the world of this movie, vampires eventually do age, and then that's it. They kind of they turn into these kind of horrible, kind of skeletal looking creatures, but they never die. And that's what happens to David Bowie. He suddenly rapidly starts to age. And Catherine Deneuve is just kind of like, well, I'll pop you up in the attic with the rest of my ex-boyfriends then, who are all still alive, and these kind of hideous, rotting vampire skeletons. And he gets popped in the attic, and David Bowie's character is kind of gone by the halfway point. And then it becomes a kind of lesbian vampire story when Catherine Deneuve's character meets this character played by Susan Sarandon, and they sort of develop a love story as well. And that's really it. It's just kind of one vampire relationship and then moves into another vampire relationship, really. It's more a film that kind of relies on its vibe and its tone and that kind of thing.
Totally. Well, that was really well done. That's better than any synopsis we've done for his movie episodes so far.
And I'm very much a person who enjoys films that are atmospheric or that are carried by vibes. And I think that's interesting because The Man Who Fell to Earth was kind of Bowie's first breakthrough movie, right? And that, of course, was David Bowie's in that, and it's no surprise that he works in this movie then too, right? Because it's another movie that's just very style over substance, I guess is another way of putting it. Yeah. And this is another movie where kind of style plays a way more integral role than the plot.
I think style is substance. We talked about Lynch earlier. Style. I mean, maybe not technically, but I prefer those kind of movies. The plot being secondary. Yeah.
Well, it relies on the theme a lot, this movie too. It doesn't really rely on your typical vampire tropes, right? It's a movie that's concerned about immortality. And one thing that keeps my sanity intact is, when thinking about my inevitable death, is that dying is infinitely better than living forever, right? Because if you live forever, you will get so incredibly bored and you'll get lonely. The cons of an immortal life heavily outweigh the pros. And I would love to see art progress hundreds of years after my time, and I'm sure everybody does. Mike is obviously interested in the evolution of horror. We'd like to see these things for the next 10,000 years, but at what cost, right?
Totally. Yeah, no, I think that's true. And I've been looking on my podcast at the history of the vampire movies. And yeah, I think that's a really interesting element that starts to come into play around this time, around the 80s, where vampire movies stop being just these kind of scary traditional monsters, Dracula and Hammer horror and that kind of thing was starting to die out. And in the 80s, we got these interesting new spins of vampire movies. Later we'd get The Lost Boys and Near Dark. Then we'd get Interview with the Vampire. And it was more about the kind of almost sympathizing with the vampires as being these kind of poor sort of emo creatures that live forever. And the kind of the problems that arise with that, right? The kind of, the sort of monotony of living eternal life. And yeah, I think that is definitely part of this movie. And you're right about the style. I think the style is sort of the substance when it comes to this film, because it is about the superficiality of looking young and beautiful, and then what happens when that dies away too. So I think the look and vibe and style and beauty of this film is kind of tied into this life that Catherine Deneuve lives, and the way in which she sort of discards all of her partners that lose their looks eventually, you know?
Well, that's another reason why I'm really glad that they used David Bowie for this movie, is because seeing him decay of all people, it's all the more striking because he's a guy that's never looked bad in his life, but this movie does the unimaginable and it strips that away and he turns into like this living corpse who's just walking around. And like you said, you sympathize with him. He's going, "Oh, please kill me, please kill me." And it's seeing David Bowie of all people in that light is just like, wow, it really shines a light on the point that they're trying to hammer home about immortality.
Yeah, you're right. He's somebody who I think, especially at the time, right, people just probably didn't even consider David Bowie ever aging or dying. You know, he feels like this guy that just should look eternally young and beautiful and unusual and all of that kind of thing. So he was a great choice for a film like this, I think.
Yeah, he was at the top of the world at that point too. He had just, launched his huge world tour. Well, I guess that came right after this.
Yeah.
But he's coming off the, Let's Dance, and he, his highest selling album of all time, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So what a contrast in this movie. Speaking of him decaying, how about the makeup? I thought it looked excellent. And it was, I think the person who did it, I can't remember the name, but was it this person who did for The Godfather?
Yeah, it's Dick Smith.
Dick Smith, okay.
Dick Smith is a fantastic, makeup artist. He had done the Godfather films, like you said. Obviously, as a horror fan, I love The Exorcist. He was the one that did, all of that amazing makeup.
Okay, wow.
All of those effects on The Exorcist were him. And later on, movies like Death Becomes Her as well. These movies really known for their kind of crazy makeup effects. So yeah, he was like a magician with what he could do. And yeah, I think that the effects, for the most part, still look amazing in this, don't they? As we see David Bowie start to rapidly age, I think it looks incredible still.
Mm-hmm. And you were talking about we were mentioning the kind of the vampire tropes are gone in this movie. It's interesting when there aren't anything, like nothing's introduced, like these are the rules. There's kind of assumed knowledge in vampire horror, like altogether. There's no real, these are the standard, like, whatever Bram Stoker said goes.
Yeah.
It's interesting how that kind of changes in this one. You just kind of assume, okay, blood can't mix. That's got to be bad. And, they can't stay in the daylight. But in this one, they can. Like, he's walking around in broad daylight, isn't he?
Yeah, it kind of, that's the other thing about the vampire genre, is that different filmmakers kind of make up their own rules for the vampires almost. And you're right. I think by this point, Dracula was such a huge thing. We had so many vampire movies throughout the kind of 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. Audiences would know what a vampire is. So I don't think there's even a single mention of the word vampire in The Hunger. I don't think they ever actually mentioned the word vampire. They don't have fangs. Like, it doesn't have a traditional kind of vampire sort of trope in that regard, with the portrayal of these characters. But I think, you just kind of assume knowledge. By the 1980s, everyone knew the deal with vampires. So I think they can have a bit of fun with it in that regard, and you can kind of have a little play around and subvert some of those tropes, I suppose. Which this film did so well.
Well, like the weapon of choice, right? It's like you said, it's not the fangs. It's like they use some sort of
like a little knife.
It's like a symbol of life. I can't remember what it was, but it's something very symbolic, right? And they use that as their weapon, which is very interesting. I think it's something that represents immortal life or something like that. But so it's just cool to kind of see them play around with. Yeah, they don't have to be in the dark. They don't have to use their fangs. They just kind of, it was just a free for all. And I think that's very interesting, because that's a common critique of, horror movies or vampire movies is, they might rely on tropes. This one just does it. Yeah, they just do whatever they want. I think that's it's a very good strategy. I think it works.
And by doing that, it opens up what is the storyline of this movie, where he's not gonna live forever. He just all of a sudden it starts to age, and that's usually the one thing you don't associate with vampires is aging, right? So it's Miriam, right? Was Miriam behind that, or did he just kind of, it was his time, because they had just feasted, had they not? And then he starts to just decay. I'm not really sure if she was behind it. She didn't seem too bothered by it.
I know it's not ever overtly kind of explained. I think why is now the time? Because he's been around for, I think, a few hundred years when we are introduced to him. Why is it suddenly now that he starts to age? And I think there is an interpretation you could make that in some way Miriam is controlling this, that like when she gets bored of certain lovers or she meets someone new or whatever, these people suddenly start to just sort of wither away.
Because
it coincides when she meets Susan Sarandon's character, right? When David kind of starts to finally decay. It's that she sees him on TV or something talking about her whatever project she was working on. So that would totally make sense.
And there's also go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and it's a scary thing, right? You know, like what's worse than living forever as a vampire and staying the same age? Probably, you know, growing really old and then living forever. Like that's like the ultimate worst nightmare, isn't it? I think. Yeah.
Oh, it's a terrible ending. It's a terrible thing. And yeah, this has happened before. Like this isn't the first time that she's gone through this. There's a big stack of, like you said, there's ex-boyfriends in the attic. Like
that's a very uncomfortable thought too. There's like a couple dozen of them, and they're just laying there, you know, like and they're still decaying. Like they're there for another, you know, for literally for forever until I guess the end of the movie. But you know, that's a horrifying thought. That's sort of like a Black Mirror or a Twilight Zone episode. You know, that's your worst thought possible. It's the worst thing that can happen to anybody.
It's
being locked away in a coffin for the rest of your life and somehow still managing to decay over time. It's just horrifying.
Well, it's a check in the box for cremation, isn't it?
It is. It really is. Yeah. And you never really know what it is that kills a vampire. Like, if they burnt them, if they set them on fire, if they beheaded them, I wonder if that would kill them. But we don't see that happen. Instead, we just see them suffer this horrible fate worse than death. Yeah, it's really great.
There's no stake being driven into the heart. But did you guys notice there's a cut scene right after, I think it's after Susan Sarandon's character gets turned. They cut to a steak on a dinner table.
Right. It's getting cut.
Yeah.
It's like,
and it was kind of, I thought that was like, you know, a nod to the all the old tropes that they're not using in this movie.
Well, didn't she like order it rarer than she normally does? Because like the husband or the boyfriend or whatever kind of goes like, oh wait, you ordered it rare because like there's blood, right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
I always wonder if it's a deliberate kind of choice or a kind of fun wink almost that the film opens with a performance of the Bauhaus song Bela Lugosi is Dead, right?
Yeah.
Bela Lugosi, famous for playing Dracula, like he was the Dracula throughout the 1930s and 40s. Almost again, this idea of like we're entering a new age of vampires. You know, this is not... This is going to be a film that kind of plays around with the vampire tropes, maybe the kind of classic ones, and does something new with them. And I don't know, it kind of feels like starting it with that very kind of 80s montagey version of Bela Lugosi is Dead kind of felt almost deliberate in that regard, you know?
And that's that might be the highlight of the movie, just that opening scene. And like they're victims who they lure back, or no, I guess they go to the victim's house, I think. But they almost seem like they could be villains. So they're too cool to be victims. Like they look cool in that nightclub.
Well, it's a great goth vibe. Like that was the perfect choice, getting Peter Murphy to do the intro. And I think it set the stage very well. I mean, it's kind of this idea now of vampires as being cool. Like you're not afraid of them. You know, you're kind of like, oh, I want to be him. Like, you know, Bowie's character looks cool. They look very, very cool. They got the aviators, the cool jackets.
Yeah.
So yeah, that intro scene sets a very cool gothic 80s vibe. You know, the 80s get a bad rap in music. But, you know, gothic, I think that's a very cool kind of subgenre that started in the 80s. And I think this movie kind of highlights all the right things about the 1980s in terms of music. And there's a great Iggy Pop scene too. They're listening to Fun Time on that. That guy's like skateboarding or something, listening to Fun Time by Iggy Pop, and
Bowie pathetically tries to stab him and it doesn't work.
Yeah, it's great. And yeah, you're right. You know, this is totally the era when vampires became cool, like aspirational almost. Like we said, you know, you get the Lost Boys and, you know, Near Dark a few years later, and those kind of movies where suddenly vampirism was cool and sexy, you know, as opposed to just scary.
Yeah, it's not your mom and dad's Dracula anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
Speaking of Bela Lugosi being dead, I love the story of him dying in the middle of Plan 9 for Outer Space being made. Yeah. And Ed Wood just kind of, maybe it was a different movie that he was going to use that footage for, and he kind of just recycled what little footage he had of Bela Lugosi and had his replacement like cover his face every time he came on screen.
Yeah, it's so good.
Plan 9 from Outer Space. What a movie. Maybe the worst. Well, I think it's infamously like the worst movie of all time. I love it. I've seen it like twice.
I'll have to see, because anytime something gets a title like that, like worst of all time, it usually means that it's at least funny or something, right? You have to see those things that get called the worst of all time.
Right. Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah.
Speaking of, does this movie get rated? Like, I'm not sure. I didn't check any reviews. Like, is this a movie that, like, has it been like critically reappraised, or was it appraised at the time, or like, I have no idea what this movie was like.
I think it wasn't particularly great at the time in terms of its reaction, critical reaction. I think people were pretty kind of snooty about it, and I think Tony Scott famously sort of said after making The Hunger, he kind of stopped reading reviews for his films because he got quite a lot of bad reviews. So yeah, I don't think it did particularly well. And I think it's definitely been a movie that's sort of slowly kind of grown over time. And I would say that in a way about a lot of Tony Scott's filmography. I don't think people necessarily took Tony Scott particularly seriously for a lot of his films, like for a lot of his career, you know, in comparison to Ridley Scott, maybe I feel like Tony Scott was kind of thought of as the one that was slightly more superficial, you know, like music video visuals and style over substance. But actually, when you go back and look at, he was a brilliant filmmaker, actually. And I think, you know, a lot of his movies now are sort of being reappraised in that way.
Well, True Romance is one of my favorite movies, like of all time, probably.
Yeah. I guess this is another benefit of having David Bowie in your movie, is that David Bowie is somebody who's going to stay relevant, you know, in popular culture for, I mean, well past, you know, our time. It'll be, you know, possibly centuries. So this is the movie that will, you know, people will always go back. I mean, the only reason I'm watching it is because I'm a David Bowie fan, right? So there will always be people that'll be returning to it when they normally wouldn't be. If it was not David Bowie, I'm sure, you know, well, we wouldn't be doing this right now. So
right, it's like bad James Bond movies or bad Elvis movies. You rewatch them, or bad Halloween movies. You rewatch it because it's part of something bigger.
Right. Yeah.
Totally. And I think also maybe there was a little bit of just like slightly more conservative kind of viewpoints that, you know, this is a movie that was a pretty erotic movie as well. It has that very famous, quite prolonged lesbian sex scene in it as well. That again, I think people just wrote it off as being kind of smut and nothing else, really, you know. And again, that this is a really interesting kind of a follow-on from the sort of vampire movies we got in the 70s, because in the 70s there was a huge wave in Europe of lesbian vampire movies. It was like a subgenre in itself, right, of just like naked lesbians sleeping with each other and biting each other, and they were made for kind of titillation and that kind of thing, but some of them are really, really good, but they were all kind of dismissed. And this movie, again, it's taking tropes of the lesbian vampire, kind of erotic vampire movies, but then making it kind of goth and cool at the same time, you know.
Well, in the 80s was an interesting time for horror too. I feel like 83, that would have been kind of in the midst of like the slasher sequel boom, right? Where you get, you know, a Friday the 13th movie every week, and Nightmare on Elm Street, I guess, was yet to come, but there was still, you know, a lot of other, like I think Jaws 2 or 3 came out the same year.
Horror was definitely being skewed younger in the 80s as well. I think that was a result of the teen slasher movie. So yeah, you had Halloween in 1978 and that boom of slasher movies and sequels that came in the early 80s. And I think suddenly everything in the 80s suddenly starts being aimed more at a teenage audience. So again, vampire movies move from these kind of like, you know, Hammer, these slightly more traditional type of movies to teen films. Again, The Lost Boys, Fright Night, that kind of thing. And that very much coincides with all the teen slasher movies we were getting. And I'm sure this movie, you know, putting David Bowie in your cast is a great way to kind of aim it at a kind of younger crowd at the time, you know?
So what about Bowie in this movie? We haven't really talked about him. We've talked about his character. How is he? Like, is his acting good?
I feel like because it's a movie that does focus on style. I mean, I think that's just the best part of his, just anything in general for him in this movie is just how he looks. And I feel like he just kind of has to act naturally, you know, and I think he does a great job of it. Just appearing cool, I think, is him doing his part. I haven't really thought about his actual acting though, if it was like up to par, but I didn't have any problems with it.
I like his vulnerability kind of in that the shower scene right after they kill that couple at the beginning. He's kind of in the shower with Catherine Deneuve, and he says something like, "Oh, we'll be doing this forever," or something, or "forever and always." And then, you know, ironically, it's like maybe that was what triggered it. Maybe that's what triggered his death. He started to worry about it, and because like right after that, it goes downhill fast.
Yeah, I think he's great as well. I mean, like again, I think maybe it's not the most challenging of acting roles in this particular film, right? But I think he does a good job. Again, he just oozes style, right? And the way he looks. I mean, again, I suppose he's always had that slightly. There's something kind of sort of sexually fluid about David Bowie, right? And I think there is obviously to that in this movie with this kind of love triangle and lesbians and everything else. And I think it all kind of, it's definitely a part of the vampire subgenre. So his look and his vibe and his style of performance really works in that regard as well, that there is this kind of fluidity to him. And yeah, I really enjoy his kind of vulnerability and his kind of despair as he starts to get older as well, you know.
The movie goes really fast too. Like there isn't an awful lot of dialogue. Like things kind of get rolling really quickly too, right? Like,
yeah, they've killed somebody like instantly. He starts aging instantly. She's found someone new instantly. Actually, also there's the little girl too. I forget her name, but it's almost like she was being like groomed
for the next lover. See, I think that is why Bowie starts decaying. Yeah, because she's already kind of moving on. Yeah, she's already picked that girl to be the next one.
Well, and she seems almost more upset that because he ends up killing her trying to get like a feed in at the last hour. And Catherine Deneuve is almost more upset that what have you done? Like when he kills her, than the fact that he's dying too.
Yeah.
And he's very feeble. He had to really, really dupe her to kill her. Cause I think that was right after he tried to kill the random guy dancing to Iggy Pop, right? He couldn't kill that guy. So he went and preyed on he went and tricked the little girl.
Mm-hmm. And that scene in the shower in the bathroom where he's looking at the young guy next to him, and it's interesting because it's Bowie and he's looking going like, oh, I want you, I want to look like you again, I want to look young.
Once again, I think that's why Bowie was such a great person for this role, because he would just never do that in real life, right? But they found a way to turn him into that type of a person.
Totally, yeah. And again, I don't know whether this was deliberate on the part of like the writers and makers of this film, but obviously it sort of coincides too with the beginning of the AIDS crisis, and there is something kind of viral about the vampirism in this idea of kind of blood passing on, and it happens after characters have sex, and then this sudden transformation that David Bowie goes through. And you'll see in the horror genre throughout the 80s that there are movies that kind of, you know, use horror metaphors to explore the kind of AIDS epidemic, like David Cronenberg's The Fly, with what happens to Jeff Goldblum. That was like famously kind of, partly kind of inspired by that. And yeah, I mean, I wonder whether there is anything to that with this as well, because again, there is that vampirism is closely linked with that kind of thing of kind of like, you know, lots of sexual partners, of exchanging bodily fluids, and then this terrifying thing happening to David Bowie and him, you know, becoming hollowed out and aged as well very, very quickly in the movie. You know, I think there's something, again, like especially in hindsight, looking at it in that through that lens, you know.
And then when Susan Sarandon sleeps with Catherine Deneuve, it's almost, she's like, does she say like, well, what have you done to me, right? Because she didn't, like, there was no agreement that I was to become a vampire, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of, I feel like there is kind of a link there.
Definitely, yeah.
Because she kind of just forces her will on everybody. I'm sure that little girl that Bowie kills, she would have been another one, right? It's like all these people are subjected to her. She's very selfish. What's her Catherine's character? Like she's very
Miriam, I think.
Miriam,
yeah, definitely.
And it was kind of funny how, what does she say? Are you making a pass at me? And then she like gets a nosebleed or something, and next thing you know it, their clothes are off and they're in
yeah. So I mean, like it does move very fast. Like even once she gets that thing wrong with her, right? Susan Sarandon's character has that problem. It's like, oh, you have you're acting weird. Let's check your blood. Okay, yeah, you've got an inhuman blood, and you know, like it kind of does move very, very fast. This movie. Sometimes it's almost absurd as to how fast it moves, but I don't think it's a movie that really bothered me with how fast it moved, because I think that the atmosphere and the style, you know, that more than makes up for the quickness.
Well, I love the atmosphere in that clinic or the hospital or whatever. Like in horror movies, they do a great job of making hospitals seem like this very isolated and dangerous place where, like, if you've ever been to a hospital, like it's warm and there's people everywhere, but it's like this, it's gloomy and it's, a lot of, I guess it was like a lot of backlighting in this movie.
Yeah. When I picture this movie in my head, it's like everything is kind of coldly lit. It's like blue and there's lots of silhouettes and it's like, it's all that kind of vibe, isn't it? It's quite cold. Yeah.
Yeah. And why are hospitals like this horrific place in movies? Like I was watching the new Chucky series, and the same kind of thing. Like they Don Mancini brought that into this new series too, of like this scary hospital, which is very much like Halloween 2, where she's not very safe in that supposedly safe place, is she?
That hospital is like a dungeon in Halloween too. It's absolutely, it's like, where are all the people?
Yeah, I don't get it.
Well, it's funny you mentioned how dark the movie is too, because I don't think I even realized until after I watched the movie that, oh, that's right, they weren't really outside in the light at all. The vampires they were in the light, but it didn't really occur to me at any point during the movie, because everything is so dimly lit and everything is so kind of black and blue. And so yeah, like I remember like after the movie going, oh yeah, they were roaming around like typical people, not vampires. But I didn't actually notice it during the movie. It never stuck out to me like, oh, that's wrong, right? So
because that kills a lot of Dracula. Like that's the one that killed Christopher Lee. He gets incinerated in the sun, right?
Yeah, and then, that's how most of them died, to be honest. It's exposed to the sunlight. Yeah.
And I guess what was the one in 1978 or 79? There was another Dracula movie that I kind of like, and that's the one where I think he's on a boat at the end and he gets
Frank Langella. That's 1979.
Frank Langella.
Yeah.
I really like the way that one looked too. That one was very gothic, and kind of like the look of this one, the way it was shot, kind of reminds me of that movie. You can tell it's made, well, maybe not the same decade, but like, three or four years apart.
Yeah, and there's almost something of a bit of like German expressionism to The Hunger as well, like a kind of, because it's so blue and black, it almost looks black and white sometimes in its color palette, and it reminded me a bit of like a Nosferatu or something, where it's lots of shadows and silhouettes and curtains and that kind of thing. Again, it kind of, Tony Scott is so good at visuals, but I think it kind of evokes all of that as well.
Yeah, and that German expressionism is like,
it's Bowie's forte.
Yeah, it's like one of the main themes in his music, especially in the 70s. And we've talked about the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari like almost every episode.
You found a way to reference.
I find a way. Yeah, it's like on our bingo card. Like, oh, Jesse talks about the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Check one out.
Well, there you go. Well, that's really interesting because, of course, Nosferatu, basically the first ever vampire movie, and that was German expressionism, and so I think there are some links there. And there's that great moment. That was the first time we saw a vampire be killed by sunlight. It's this where he touches his chest and reaches up and disappears in the sunlight. So yeah.
Was there anything else, Mike, that you wanted to touch on with The Hunger that we haven't got to yet?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think what's really interesting about it, especially talking about it, in the David Bowie context, is that I think the film is at its best when it's like the first half of The Hunger, I think, is the best stuff. And actually, I do think that for me, the film slightly loses something after Bowie's character dies. I think the film is really at its best and it's most stylish and it's most interesting. Like we talked about, that amazing opening sequence, that first like 10 minutes is incredible. And then everything with the amazing makeup effects of David Bowie aging, that for me is all the most interesting stuff. And there's some good moments with Catherine Deneuve and Susan Sarandon in the second half, but for me it is like, it's all about that first act with David Bowie's character. It's so good.
Yeah. And it's interesting how the movie ends, isn't it? Like, I thought that, what's her name, Susan Sarandon's character, I can't remember, but does she kill herself? She kind of cuts her throat and then bleeds out into Miriam's mouth or something. I don't know what happened, but then she's okay at the end. She's, living.
Yes. And I believe the final scene was added at the request of the studio. I think the ending was changed by the studio to kind of quickly give it some closure. I think that there was going to be a more, open-ended kind of, more ambiguous sort of style ending. And then the studio wanted a way to kind of like wrap it up. And I think Tony Scott was quite upset about that. And so was Susan Sarandon as well. But I think that weird ending was kind of forced upon them by the studio, as much as I can recall.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in 2022, is this a movie that you would recommend to somebody, to horror fans?
Yeah, I would. It's interesting. I talked about this recently with a guest I had on the podcast, Axel Carolyn, and she was saying that when she was young in the 90s, this film was kind of thought of as very uncool because, it had only been a decade. And so by that point, the 80s didn't seem that cool. And it kind of seemed a bit dated and passé. And now it's come back around, I think, right? And there's something about this film that looks incredibly cool. And yeah, I think it's now aged really, really well. I think that I would recommend this to everyone just for its style and vibes alone,
Yeah. Well, the 80s are cool again, right?
And
Very much
I would
so.
I would totally recommend it just for how they focus on something that I think is so important. That's the loneliness and in an immortal life. Because I mean, yeah, they focus on the decaying too, and obviously that would be horrible. When you turn into the way David Bowie and all those vampires turn into, that's a horrible thought. Losing your beauty, but it's like beyond that. It's like even if you could live forever and you could keep your looks forever, even if your looks aged, on a relative curve to how long you're going to live, you're still going to suffer all that psychological trauma. It's like, imagine you own several pet dogs in your life, right? They'll die on you every 10 to 15 years, maybe 3 times in your life. But like imagine that times like 10,000 or times infinity, right? Like your children will die, your lover will die, your next lover will die, all your friends, your next friend. Like that's a lot of pain. And so I think it really shines light on just how foolish the I guess like the quest for I think a lot of people like really would like to live forever. And I think this movie does a great job of showing how that's just literally quite possibly the worst thing that could happen to anybody.
Yes, agreed 100%. Yeah.
Well, I saw something online the other day and it was like a question. One of those stupid things on Twitter, would you rather win the lottery or double your lifespan? And I was thinking, if you had to double your lifespan, you might, and you didn't have the money to do so, you'd still have to work for like a good portion of your life. You'd still have to do all the mundane things. And you'd have to lose everybody and then possibly lose everybody again. So like even doing it twice over, I'd take the money and then just use my time that I have. You'd almost have more time in your one life with the money.
Well, it's made me think again too, because I often answer the question, would you like to live forever? I'm like, oh, well, no, but I'd like to live for 1,000 years or 10,000 years. And I'm thinking about it. It's like, no, maybe 80, 60, 70, 90. I think that's sounding pretty good right about now, actually. So.
I mean, the best deal would be like, I'd like to live until I've had enough, right? Until I quit. So like, if I want to stay alive till I'm 100, great. If I find that I've had enough by 70, great. Like leave it, let it be my choice,
Having the option, the button to push, that would be optimal, of course.
Yeah.
But our current set of circumstances is definitely preferable to that of those in the vampires in this movie, right? So
definitely, yeah.
So before we go, this is our chance to talk about horror. I mean, it's a huge passion of ours, and this is it for Bowie. Mike, what's your favorite scary movie? If you had to pick one, I know that's impossible.
Oh man, it's so hard. I have about 5 or 10 that I use as this answer, but if I was to pick the movie that I think is the best made horror movie and the scariest movie ever made, it would be the Texas Chainsaw Massacre from 1974. I think that is a terrifying movie, so much so that I haven't seen it that many times. There are way more movies that I've seen more. Like if I picked the one that I would just put on the most and rewatch the most, it would probably be something like Scream from 1996. Yeah. That's probably the horror film I've seen more than any other. But I think the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is the most masterfully made horror movie ever. It is like from beginning to end, just pure terror. Like you just feel like you're watching some sort of snuff movie almost, when actually the genius of it is that there's no gore, there's barely any blood, there's very little on-screen violence. It's just the filmmaking is so good that you feel like you're watching the most harrowing thing imaginable, So
I've never really thought about that. It's like not really gory at all, is it?
The dinner scene's the most terrifying thing I've ever seen.
It's so scary.
My favorite, actually, I'm glad you mentioned the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. One of my favorite shirts I have is just, well, it's Leatherface, but it's got the grandpa. The grandpa is like my favorite looking character, I think, in a horror movie. He's just kind of he looks like a mannequin almost.
Is he the one who has like the hammer and he's always
it's like that film is like a nightmare that you just can't wake up from, like, and it just keeps going and going. And even from the very beginning, and it starts with that voice and it's like the film you are about to see, like everything about it makes my blood run cold. I think it's just like brilliant filmmaking.
Yeah. Johnny, what's your favorite scary movie? If you had to pick one, I'm putting you on the spot.
Ooh, that is a tough one. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is up there for me too, and you made a very good point, or a good case for it. But I'm trying to think. I mean, like Scream was the one that we grew up on.
That was my gateway.
Right? Like that was. It's definitely the one that I've watched the most, and I don't know if I would call it my favorite. but I'm running out of ideas here, so I might just have to go for it by default.
I'm gonna cheat and say I love the trilogy of George Romero zombie movies because they're all so good in different ways. Like I mean, Night of the Living Dead is just iconic, and then Dawn of the Dead kind of is he's making fun of consumerism in a sense. It's happening, it all happens in the mall, and then maybe the best is Day of the Dead, where that's where you start to hate the humans and cheer for the zombies. I absolutely love that one.
Yeah, it's brilliant, isn't it? Yeah, there are so many. I mean, obviously The Shining is up there for me. I think it's just a masterpiece and it's terrifying. John Carpenter's The Thing is like perfect as well. There are too many to count.
Okay, well, Mike, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a pleasure to have you on the show. Maybe let our listeners know where they could find you and anything else you have going on. I'm sure, October for a horror podcast is quite busy.
It is. It's super busy. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah. So you can find my podcast, The Evolution of Horror, wherever you find your podcast on any podcast app. And yeah, best thing to do is just follow us on Twitter at Evolution Pod. And we're always posting about any other things going on, events or, whatever else. If you're in the UK, we do a lot of kind of public events and screenings in London, and we do like a monthly cult screening in London where we pick a classic horror movie and we'll watch it together with an audience and that kind of thing. So there's a lot of stuff going on like that through the month of October here. So yeah.
Awesome. Thanks. That sounds like a lot of fun. All right. So that's it for The Hunger, 1983 David Bowie movie. He's in another movie in 1983, Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, he filmed, and both debuted at the Cannes Film Festival, I think the same day, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe a day apart or something. So that's kind of neat. Very busy times for Mr. Bowie. So that'll be our next episode, Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence. But for now, that's it. Signing out. I've been Jesse.
I'm John.
And thank you, Mike, for joining us once again.
Thank you for having me.